G'day MotoHikers, just going to do a quick how-to video for doing the wheel bearings on a DR650 the easy way. We're about to head off on a trip through northern New South Wales hinterland, and this wheel had just the tiniest little bit of a knock in the wheel bearing. When you'd grab it top and bottom and sort of shimmy the wheel, you could just feel it click. But with such a big trip ahead, we figured we would change the wheel bearings out before we go. Even though they probably would last, but it's not a chance I want to take. I don't want to be doing this on the side of the track when you see how easy it is when you're doing it in the shed with all the right tools. In terms of tools, probably the most important one is the heat gun. That's what makes the job so easy, that and a freezer. Bit of a lump hammer, a copper drift. Now I've got a couple of sockets here, like big industrial sockets, and they're the same size as the outside races of the bearings in case I need to drive them in at all. And I've got an old screwdriver that's missing the magnetic tip, and that actually makes a really good drift for catching the edge of the first bearing, because you've got a spacer in there that makes it a little bit hard. So in terms of the wheel's construction, got a bearing on this side with a seal. I've already loosened that seal off, but we're going to pop that out and try and save the oil seal because I wasn't able to get another one from the bearing shop. Interestingly, the oil seal on the pop-out seal on the DR650 I think is a 5mm, and the ones that they sell at the bearing shop that are the right diameters I think are 7, so they're slightly thicker. So I think that's a genuine only part if you need new seals. So there's our bearing on the disc side, and then on this side we have the cush drive. That all comes apart. Now it has, cush drive has its own bearing and its own oil seal. Take the spacer out, it has its own bearing in there. Now if your cush drive rubbers are worn and sloppy, you'll chew through these bearings because you've got so much torque on the sprocket loading up that bearing on the axle that you'll chew those bearings out. Now that one feels a little bit worn, I suppose you'd say, and it has a spacer in it as well, which we need to knock out, which is what that's for. But we'll do these wheel bearings first. Now these bearings actually aren't all that old. I changed these bearings 2 years ago before a trip across the Simpson Desert. So they've done a Simpson trip, and they've done a 2-week trip, and then other than that just a few day rides, all up about 7, probably 8,000 kilometres that these bearings have done, and they're starting to wear, so time for them to go. So first things first, we will heat up. So we're going to knock this one out first on the push drive side. So I'm not applying heat to the bearing, I'm trying to apply heat just to the housing around the outside, not pointing this at the bearing itself or into the hole. We just want to get some heat into that and make it expand a bit, and that'll make it much easier to get out. Righto, so that should be warm enough without putting any heat on the bearing, because we don't want the bearing to expand, we just want the housing. Now you need to come in at a bit of an angle there, try and catch the edge of that bearing so that and just work each side, and if you've heated it up enough it just almost falls out. So there it is. Now that bearing is cold, that's got a bit of heat in it. There's the spacer that goes between them. Now when you're driving that bearing out, you've got the spacer in the way, so you're coming through from this side. If you can imagine, that spacer's sitting in there. It's got the same inside diameter as the bearing, but the spacer can move. You need to lever the spacer over to the side a bit so you can just catch the edge of the bearing and give it a knock, and then change sides and work your way down, and the bearing will just work out of that face. Now, if you're doing it on the side of the track, you know, on a trip or you don't use a heat gun, what can happen is that you're driving that bearing out and the bearing can bite into that housing and actually score the housing and chew it out. And I've got 3 sets of wheels for these DR650s, and one set I bought second hand from a motorcycle hire company, and as they were clearing out all of their gear, and when I got it home I realised that that hub had been chewed out so much so that the bearing actually wouldn't retain in there. That was, I don't know whether it spun a bearing or whether it was just rough workmanship changing bearings. I suspect rough workmanship. However, if you do find yourself with a wheel like that, you can get this product. It's Loctite 660. Okay, and what you can do is actually coat the outer race of the bearing with this stuff, or the inside of the recessed area that the bearing sits into. You give it a bit of a coat, drop that bearing in and let it set, and it's designed exactly for that. It's designed for fitting bearings to worn shafts and worn housings, and it'll set and it'll take up something like 0.2 of a millimetre or thereabouts. So if you've got just that little bit of play where the bearing will sit in there loose, apply that stuff and that'll lock the bearing in place and set. So now we knock this side out, so we've got to heat it up first.
So you're going to fill some desert dirt in there, some dirty grease.
Just remembered, haven't done the push drive. So again, I'm going to try and save this seal just by getting the big screwdriver right in underneath it and just gently, you've got to be careful that you get all the way through underneath it so that you're not tearing the rubber, because these are a solid seal. They've got the brass or something in them, they're solid, and then it's coated in rubber, and you've got to get all the way in under that edge because that's the stiff edge. The outer edge is soft, this inner edge here is soft. This edge out here is hard, so you want to get the screwdriver in underneath that hard edge and just work your way around and pop it out. So there's our bearing that goes in the push drive, and it's got a spacer in it which we will just knock out. It's good to have a couple of blocks of hardwood so that you're not trying to drive things into your bench. That's the spacer. It's got a big side and a little side. The little side goes inside the bearing. Okay, now same process, heat this up. Actually, I've just realised this is the bit that's chewed out. Look at this. That bearing is loose in there. So, I'll show you so you get to see this stuff in action. Not as bad as I remember. But anyway, so when we put this all back together, we'll apply some of this stuff so that that bearing can't just fall out. That should be tight in there. And so we'll fix that. Okay, so we'll get cleaned up and then we'll put the new ones in. Okay, so just giving everything a clean up, all our spacers, a little bit of corrosion on that one. There's our inner spacer. That's the one for the cush drive, and then that's our 2 outer spacers. So I'm going to apply just a really thin smear of grease to this inner spacer, just to stop it going rusty, because you get a bit of water trapped in there, and then next time you open it up you find that it can be a real mess of rust. Won't worry about getting any on the inside, because I'll put a smear of grease on the axle before we reinstall it. Yeah, same with this inner spacer for the cush drive bearing. And because I'm reusing these seals and they're not great, I'm just going to put a bit of grease on them as well, just to help them seal up. Ideally these ones would be being replaced, but can't get them in time, so put a bit of grease on there just to help it seal. Yep. There we go, so they're all ready to go. Now, let's get this off my hands. Over here, we've got the little esky bag, and inside we've just got a couple of ice packs with our bearings. Now those bearings have been in the freezer. We've just got them in there to keep them super cold. The colder they are, the better. Those bearings have been sitting in the freezer for like 2 days. They don't need to be in there that long, but yeah, just so that they're as small as they're going to get. And then we're going to heat up this a little and drop in our first bearing. So this time we're heating the inside as well as the outside, because we want that hole to open up. Okay, that's pretty warm, hot to the touch, so shut that off. Grab our first bearing. Now these take 2, the wheel bearings are both the same. I'll give you the numbers in a sec, but the one for the hub is bigger. Now these are double sealed, the stock bearings, there we go, just sits in the hole when it's that easy. So as that transfers heat from the housing to the bearing's going to expand, the hub's going to contract, and we'll have a nice tightly fitted bearing. So we just leave that for a minute so that when I tip it over it doesn't just fall out again. And we heat up the other side. It feels tight enough. I'm avoiding putting too much heat down the hole because I don't want to damage the seals on the other bearing that I've already installed. You've got a rubber seal on this side of the bearing. As I said before, the standard Suzuki bearings that come in the wheel are only sealed on the outside. So any water that does make its way in there, you pull them out and you find that they're rusty. And I pulled a set out yesterday. I'll pull them out of the bin and show you when we're finished. And they've come out of the DR that I've got, that's the newer one, and they're the original bearings that have come out, and they got rust and everything. And that bike saw very little dirt before I got it. It was just used as a road bike, but the bearings were in terrible shape. So spacer, I don't drop it in, try and place it in there so that you don't knock the other bearing. So in theory these are about minus 18 degrees, and just plop it in. And in theory there'll be very little gap between the spacer and the bearing if everything's gone together properly. Now if you find that you need to drive them in, That's what these sockets are for. Okay, so this socket here is basically just small enough to fit in the hole, but it rests on the, if you bring the camera over, it'll rest on that outer race of the bearing, so that if I did have to drive it in with my lump hammer, I'm not putting any pressure on the inner race, I'm not putting any pressure on the bearings, I'm just applying the pressure to the outer race and pushing it down. But if you do it this way, you shouldn't need to drive them in, they should just drop into place. So, that's our two bearings. They're in there nicely. Spacer is in there. We can pop our oil seals in. So this seal goes on this side. That's the smaller one. Goes on the disc side. I'll just push him in. So we can do the hub. We'll get under this light and you'll see that now you can actually see the residue of last time I replaced the bearings. I used that Loctite product. Where I didn't apply the Loctite, you can see how damaged it was, quite scored. Cool. So that's that bearing back in. Obviously that stuff needs to set, so we'll just put it all back together, pop the seal in, sit the spacer in, like so. And that's basically it. With the spacer just pointing out, so the sprocket side spacer, which is the bigger one of the two, you can see it's got a little lip in it. So when that's all dirty and greasy with chain lube and crud all over it, you can't see that lip, so it'd be easy to try and force it in or sit it in there the wrong way. But it actually has a way that goes the right way, so that it goes in and clips into that seal. And same with this guy. Just put a bit of a smear. It actually has a little lip there. I'm going to go to the wheel here. As a retainer into that seal. Like that. So that's it. Wheel bearings are done. We'll let that Loctite set overnight before we reassemble it back onto the bike, just so that it gets a really good chance to bond. And well, it's done about 10,000 kilometres like that since I fixed it last time, 7,000 kilometres, and I've used it prior. So that stuff seems to work pretty well. It hasn't gotten any worse. The bearing hasn't been spinning in there and chewing out all the aluminium inside that housing. So Loctite 606 seems to work. Just in terms of bearing numbers, so the wheel bearings in an SKF, I'll get to something else in a minute, SKF 6204 2RSH C3 are the wheel bearings, so they're sealed on both sides. And then the sprocket bearing is, this one's a FAG, 6205 C2HRS C3, so slightly bigger, 6205 instead of 6204. Just as a side note, when this bike with the yellow tank was used 2 years ago to do the Simpson Desert Crossing, I put new wheel bearings in it before I left. They were a popular brand, sold in motorbike shops. Trendy name, All Balls. They're shit. They were absolute rubbish. I rode from, so it had brand spanking new bearings in it, done this way, so no damage to the bearing putting them in. I rode from Burke to Birdsville, and there was physical movement in the front wheel by the time I got there. Absolute rubbish bearing, don't bother. Those SKF bearings, high quality bearing from a bearing store, you just go in with the numbers and get a good quality bearing. $32 for a good quality set of bearings. I think I paid more than that, $35 for the balls and all. Rubbish. So go to a bearing store and buy a quality European or Japanese bearing, not some rebranded junk from China. Fortunately, believe it or not, the service station at Birdsville, I walked in and said, this is going to be a long shot, but I'm after a set of wheel bearings for a DR650. I'd Googled the numbers, so I had them on my phone. 6204. The bloke went up into a loft in the workshop, came back down, 2 SKF bearings, 20 bucks. Couldn't believe it, in Birdsville, of all places. So don't risk it with balls and all. Anyway, rant over. We'll get this back together. Get this bike back together. It's pretty much ready to go. Wheel goes back on. It's got a new battery just been put in. Brand new front tyre. Those wheel bearings are good. Panniers go on, bag on the back. Start loading gear on, and that bike will be ready to go. This one out here we've just finished. So again, made up a new set of panniers because I didn't like the ones I had before. So just made up some new panniers out of jerry cans, new tyre, new wheel bearings, new front tyre, and everything's pretty much right to go. Yeah, so we head off in 2 days, assuming that the young fella behind the camera passes his learner's permit at 9 AM on Wednesday morning. If he doesn't, then I might be getting on the other yellow beast, this one, and he might have to go on the back, which would be a damn shame. No. But anyway, we'll see how he goes passing his learner's permit. He's done it in the car, he's passed it in the car, so he should be able to pass it on the bike. We'll see. Anyway, that's all. We'll get this all back together and we'll see you in the next video.